Our topic tonight is navigating loss and life changes. And I think it's reasonable to assume that everybody that is here, whether they're a caregiver or not, is certainly experiencing a lot of life changes as we all live through this pandemic. We know even without a pandemic that caregivers face a lot of challenges and changes that come at you, a lot of losses, not just the person that you take care of, but a myriad of other things. So let's see if I can pull up the poll. So a couple of questions for you. Question 1, have you experienced any of the following since the pandemic started? So go ahead, you can click on those answers and answer the question. Anxiety, stress, depression, fatigue. I see that my friends are telling me that the polling is not available. I'm wondering, I think you can see it now. So go ahead and click on your responses. What are you feeling? And you can certainly answer more than one. And then the question below, have you lost a loved one during this pandemic? So about half the folks here with us are voting. I apologize. We do have some folks who are here via telephone, and this is unfortunately something that we can't share with you via phone, but I am inquiring of our guests who's experienced anxiety, stress, depression, fatigue, burnout, loneliness, and who has lost a loved one. So I'm going to guess by now it looks like most of our folks have voted. Can you see the results? You cannot. Let me share. Oh, and I'm sorry, somebody's written in the chat that they're not able to provide an answer. So I apologize for that. Again, we're still learning about this technology. What I can tell you is that, share the results. Let me show you that. So I think that you can see that now. A lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, depression, fatigue, burnout. We are feeling it all. And then sadly, a number of you have lost loved ones. And so we're very sorry for that. I think this is a perfect topic to happen right now. And I'm very excited. Let me get rid of that. Very excited to welcome our speaker tonight. And let me see if I can bring Kalli up on the screen. Again, forgive me. So Kalli, asking you to unmute and start your video screen. Perfect. So folks, let me introduce, I'm very happy to introduce Kalli Van Waveren. Did I say that right, Kalli?
You did. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Kalli is a passionate thanatologist and grief counselor and the hospice bereavement lead for Frederick Health. Kalli is an alumnus of Johns Hopkins University and Hood College, where she now teaches in the Department of Psychology and Counseling. Kalli has years of experience counseling clients across the lifespan on an array of issues related to end-of-life decision-making and bereavement. Kalli has formed strong partnerships with lots of agencies in our community and has collaborated to write various grants and provide educational workshops and trainings. She regularly facilitates grief support groups at hospice, Frederick County Public Schools, Fort Detrick, retirement communities, assisted living facilities, addiction treatment centers, and places of worship. Kalli is also the creator of the Frederick Grief Support Network, an effort inspired by the COVID-19 pandemic and the desire to connect isolated people grieving a range of losses. Kalli, we are really happy to have you here. So give me a second to get myself off the screen and we will give you the full picture. Perfect, it's all yours.
All right, so let me see, I'm trying to find where my, there we go. All right. So, hope everyone can see that. I am excited to be sharing with you tonight. And I really appreciate everybody who participated in that poll, sharing their answers. And as you saw, most everyone who participated is experiencing some anxiety, is experiencing stress. And I think that this is a really important, it's really important to acknowledge that if you're struggling right now, that you're not alone. I think that we're all sort of operating in silos right now, and we're disconnected from resources and relationships probably in a way that we never have been before this pandemic. And I don't know about you, but I can say that in my own life, both personal and professional, I've encountered a lot of reluctance when it comes to being open and candid about just how incredibly difficult this time really has been, and frankly will probably continue to be, at least for a while. And what happens when we feel like we can't talk about or can't even acknowledge our thoughts and our feelings, our heartaches and our hardships and our grief, is that these hurts and challenges can begin to feel even more overwhelming and even more insurmountable, and that we feel even more alone. And this is when we really run the risk of mental health issues and crises. So one of my primary objectives tonight really is just hammering home for you this fact that you're not alone if you're struggling right now. And I truly believe that if everyone were asked this and were to give an honest answer, they would say that the past 6 months have really been a struggle in a number of ways, have really been stressful in a way that probably most of us have not experienced before. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we can do to navigate these challenges and the emotions that we're experiencing in a time when many of us are completely cut off, or mostly cut off at any rate, from the people and things to which we would normally turn for comfort and support. Here's a quote that just kind of speaks to this as well. It's from a psychologist named Michael Horber at Tulane University. We are facing a mental health tsunami. Our analyses from shortly after the pandemic declaration are the tip of the iceberg. Due to factors such as unanticipated death, burnout, and unemployment, over time, we should begin to see a greater decline in societal mental health. One of the analyses to which he is referring has to do with this study that's related to the infographic that's on the screen now. This is from the American Psychological Association, and it depicts internet search terms related to anxiety surrounding the start of the pandemic. You can see that vertical line over to the right of each graph is sort of where they're marking the start of the pandemic in the United States. And so you can see that search terms related to anxiety and stress really spike around that time, as well as searches for mental health support. And so really you can see that anxiety, stress, and even panic have been pervasive and have remained elevated even after the initial crisis. So what exactly is anxiety? So a broad definition would be a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. Anxiety also relates to a mental health condition that's characterized by feelings of worry, anxiety, or fear that may be strong enough to interfere with one's daily activities. The thing about anxiety is that it's not a standalone experience. Anxiety has huge impacts on our mental and even on our physical health and on our overall sense of well-being. Anxiety incites our sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight or flight response. And I would say that many of us have been in a sort of chronic sympathetic nervous system engagement for about half a year now. And it's exhausting, and it can lead to all sorts of physical ailments like lowered immunity, even cardiac issues, and certainly it increases our risk of depression and other mental health conditions. And in fact, anxiety and depression are closely related and often go hand in hand and have sort of a reflexive symbiotic relationship. So anxiety can really be a big deal. And some risk factors for anxiety would be trauma. And maybe some of you have seen, there have been a number of articles sort of talking about how this pandemic has been a global trauma. Certainly it's been stressful. And if you are a caregiver or if you are grieving, you already know a lot about stress probably. And the pandemic certainly has added to that. Likewise, I think that most of us probably have experienced social isolation in a way that we never have before. Loneliness, I mean, I think who would have predicted that we would be doing the majority of our interactions through cameras? It's really hard. It's bizarre. It's surreal. And it certainly contributes to us all feeling disconnected from each other, I think. And that definitely, you know, humans are kind of built for community. It's hardwired in us to want to connect. Gender, and I mention gender only because there's also a correlation between caregiving and gender. About 68% of family or informal caregivers are female. That's according to the Family Caregiver Alliance. And multiple studies suggest that women are about twice as likely to suffer from anxiety. And then, of course, we've talked a little bit about depression. And then the last risk factor for anxiety I'd like to mention is grief and loss. And of course, as a grief counselor, this is where I want to spend some time tonight. So grief and loss, there's a multifaceted way to look at this, especially within the context of the coronavirus pandemic. Obviously, this is a heavy time. You know, sitting here talking tonight, there have been over 211,000 deaths from COVID-19 in the United States alone. And each of those 211,000 plus people has multiple people who love them and who are grieving them and hurting tonight. And even beyond those people who have died from COVID throughout the pandemic, there have been countless others who have died from other causes and who, because of the pandemic, have not been able to be with their loved ones throughout their illness or at the time of their death. And I talk to people every day who still have not been able to have a funeral or a memorial service for their loved one because of the pandemic, or have not been able to be with their family during this time to come together and grieve together and heal together. And I know that if you're grieving the death of someone you love, that something unimaginably painful has been made so much heavier and so much more painful and so much more difficult during this time. And I'm so sorry for that. And I would love to help you to get connected with grief support resources if you're not already. I would also argue that even for those of us who have not lost a loved one during the pandemic, that all of us are currently grieving, and we're grieving a variety of non-death and non-finite losses. So let's talk a little bit about what grief is. Grief is an internal experience of thoughts, feelings, emotions, and memories that occur after a death or a non-death loss. We can also say that grief is the process of psychological, social, and somatic reactions to the perception of a loss. And this is really a key point about grief, is that grief has to do with a person's perception of their loss. And this is really especially important when we're talking about non-death losses. So for an example, to kind of illustrate the point I'm trying to make, it would be maybe the loss of a job. So one person might lose a job, and to them, because of their own unique experiences and personality and worldview, they might feel like the loss of a job is something that just happens in a person's professional career. At some point you lose a job, and you know, challenges happen with the economy, or companies downsize or whatever, and it's just kind of a fact of life. And they're able to experience that job loss and accommodate it and just kind of move forward. Where for another person, losing a job might be really destabilizing. They might internalize that as a judgment on their ability or their value. They could suffer with depression and really have a hard time recovering from that loss of employment. So it's the same type of loss on its face, it's the same, but two individuals are perceiving it in two very different ways, and that's what informs the grief experience, or perhaps an absence even of a grief experience. So perception is hugely important. And what is loss? There are really two types of loss, broadly speaking. One is more concrete, the death of a loved one, separation or divorce, loss of home or possessions, loss of sight or hearing, and I'm sure that you could think of many other examples. And then we also have sort of more symbolic or abstract losses that we all experience all the time throughout our lives. The loss of status or identity, loss of mobility or health, the loss of a dream or goal, the loss of youth, loss of what you never had or will never be. And again, I think that we could keep coming up with lots of different examples. So to talk about different types of losses, and I want to say clearly, and I'll probably say this a couple more times throughout the presentation, that loss of any kind does trigger a grief response. Now, the kind of grief that we experience after the death of a loved one is going to be different than the type of grief we experience if we lose a job. But I think that it's really important to recognize that non-death losses do have their own grief, and it's important to recognize that, to validate that, and to feel that. So a non-death loss really is grief caused by the loss of anything significant to a person. And throughout our lives, we will experience many non-death losses. I think probably all of us could just take a few seconds and think of some non-death losses we've experienced since the start of the pandemic. And some of these may kind of feel easy to integrate into our lives, and others feel really destabilizing. There's also something called cumulative loss. We sometimes will refer to this as bereavement burnout or bereavement overload, and it refers to the experience of suffering a second loss before the first loss can be accommodated, or experiencing multiple losses at the same time or back to back. You know, I think that, for instance, at the beginning of the pandemic, many of us lost a number of things all at once. Maybe we lost social support. Some of us maybe lost income or lost employment. We lost freedom. We lost comfort. Maybe we lost hope or a sense of being able to look forward to the future. And all of these losses, I think, kind of happened all at once. And what happens when we experience multiple losses is that the grief intensifies. And sometimes it's hard to deduce which loss is causing which feelings and which thoughts, which can kind of make processing our experience a little bit more difficult, more complicated if we're trying to first deduce what we're feeling upset about or what's driving which emotional experience. And certainly cumulative loss can inhibit the expression of normal, healthy grief and can pose challenges to healing. So it's important, I think, to disentangle the multiple losses when we experience cumulative loss and to really try to deduce as much as we can what exactly we're grieving. Non-finite loss is something that I would argue that we're all experiencing in a way right now as well. This term refers to loss and grief that endures for an indeterminate amount of time. And I think, of course, we find ourselves in a situation right now that is indeterminate. We don't know how long the pandemic is going to last, and so we don't know how long certain challenges that we're facing or losses that we're encountering are going to last. And that's a really uncomfortable and sometimes painful space to occupy. This not knowing can be extremely stressful and just profoundly difficult. Another type of loss that I'd like to talk about, and that I think is particularly salient right now, and particularly if you are a caregiver, is ambiguous loss. So this is a term that refers to a loss where there's an element of incompleteness or uncertainty. There are two types of ambiguous loss. One is where a person is physically present, but emotionally or psychologically absent. And the other is where a person is physically absent, but emotionally or psychologically present. So in the first example, we might think of people with Alzheimer's disease or dementia, or even certain types of chronic or terminal illness in which a person is mentally compromised in some way. And in the second type of ambiguous loss, I think is something that has been very common during this pandemic. An example would be people who have a loved one in a facility and they're not able to be with them, or even people who are geographically separated from loved ones and not able to be there present with them. And again, we're talking about something that is indeterminate in a number of ways. And so I think that in these instances, there's also an element of anxiety about whether or not being able to be present again is possible. So this is a really difficult, to say the least, thing to try to navigate psychologically and emotionally. And then just quickly, anticipatory grief is a grief that we experience before a potential loss. I think that it's something that many of us are probably familiar with, especially if we have been caregivers, even though there's nothing really that can prepare us for the loss of a loved one. The experience of anticipating it is in its own way very unique type of grief that's distinct from the grief that we feel after the death of a loved one. And then the last type of grief that I would like to talk about is disenfranchised grief. And this just refers to grief that is not really acknowledged. And I think it's particularly important to mention disenfranchised grief when we're talking about non-death and non-finite loss, because it often is disenfranchised. And I think, for instance, as we're talking about these different non-death losses during the pandemic, we can say, well, at least I'm not having this experience, or at least, this didn't happen to me, or I should be grateful because, and yes, there's a lot that can be said for focusing on the positives and maintaining perspective. And yes, other people are going through things that are harder than what you're going through probably. But what happens when we invalidate our own experience, and when we don't acknowledge the painfulness of our reality to ourselves or to others, is that we disenfranchise ourselves. This makes coping and healing a lot more difficult. It's really important to acknowledge our losses and to create space and time for losses to be grieved. It's really critical, I think, just for mental health and our emotional well-being. And so again, just to emphasize, the psychological, mental, emotional, and spiritual response to any loss is a type of grief. I'd also like to just at least mention some of the losses that are common to caregivers. Often a loss of independence, of freedom, time, the ability to pursue hobbies or have fun, sleep, health, privacy, sex and intimacy, relationships, social life, maybe identity, dreams for the future, time with other family members, of course, aspects of your relationship with your loved one. I talk to people on pretty much a daily basis who share about feeling like they have less opportunity to be a daughter or son or a spouse because of some of the demands of caregiving, and feeling that shift in your relationship with your loved one is certainly a loss. And then in some cases, the loss is the loved one themselves. So some common grief reactions, I think there's very little that is uncommon or would be considered abnormal. Probably most of us, when we think of grief, think about sadness or crying, but certainly there's an array of other emotions or emotional displays that are common. Disbelief, shock, anger, fear, anxiety, relief, guilt, and many, many other things. Again, there's very little that is abnormal. And yet, I think because grief is so overwhelming, and often because grief doesn't exist in a vacuum, there's other stuff going on as well. It can be hard to deduce what exactly, it is driving what, or to even really identify all of the things that we're feeling. So I always like this. It's kind of just a silly little picture, but I think it's a good reminder that sometimes, even though everything looks calm above the surface, there's a lot going on underneath. But grief is not, it's not optional, it's not weakness. It's distinct from sadness or depression. It's not a bad attitude or a wrong perspective. It's not a condition or a mental illness. It's certainly not orderly or predictable. And again, we do have a tendency to minimize grief, especially from non-death losses, but all grief is legitimate and is even healthy. Um, and healing from grief and loss requires us to recognize first what has been lost, to allow ourselves to feel the weight and the pain of that loss, and to engage in activities and habits that support us and encourage healing and growth. So that's kind of where we're going to go next. So I'm going to talk a little bit about self-care, or I like to say caregiving inward. But first, I think it's important to say that when we're talking about caregivers, there's a certain type of person who tends to become a caregiver, because not everyone will or would. And although there are a number of completely legitimate reasons why people decide that it's not best that they become their loved one's primary caregiver, I would argue that those who do willingly take on the mantle of caregiving have some common traits. Most remarkably, caregivers tend to put the needs of others before their own needs. And I've known a number of caregivers who will neglect even their basic well-being because they prioritize the needs of others so much. And I think that it's really important to acknowledge as we move into a discussion about self-care, because a number of caregivers, for a number of caregivers, that the very concept of self-care or prioritizing oneself may not only be not habitual, it could even feel profoundly uncomfortable. And yet self-care is critical for all of us, but I think especially for caregivers, and actually that we're better caregivers to others when we are also caregivers to ourselves. So I'll get off the soapbox now. But what is self-care? I think that in our country we have a really distorted idea about and dialogue around this idea of self-care. And we often talk about it as actions, as doing things, and a lot of things that take time or that are inaccessible in some way, like having a spa day or going and getting a massage or pedicure or whatever. And while all of those things are examples of a specific type of self-care, self-care really is a mindset. It's a philosophy of living and a way of interacting with ourselves. So when I talk about self-care with my clients, there are kind of these big three. These are the most important pillars of self-care, and we don't talk about them a lot. But the first one is saying no, is drawing boundaries. No matter how awesome you are, we're all finite beings, and there are limits on what we can and what we should do. I've talked a little bit about the types of people that become caregivers, and one of the traits that I think caregivers have in common, obviously, is a desire to help. And for helpers, it can be particularly uncomfortable and contrary to our natures to say no or to place limits on what we're able or willing to do for others. But we have to, and learning this is one of the biggest deals for our mental health and well-being. Second one is also challenging for most of us, I think. Ask for help, accept help. And, you know, again, it's much easier said than done. And if you're a caregiver, there's a good chance that you're a lot more comfortable offering and giving help than you are with asking for and accepting it. Another piece of this is that many of us have had the experience of well-meaning friends and family members saying things like, please let me know if I can do anything for you, or here if you need anything, which is nice, but not always particularly helpful. First of all, we might not know if they really mean it. And then also, we don't want to be an inconvenience. And then sometimes we might not even know what we actually need, especially if we're grieving or stressed or overwhelmed. Right? It's much more helpful when people offer specific things. So what I would suggest to you would be to think about specific things you can ask for. For instance, would having some extra Ensure or paper towels or cereal save you a trip to the store at some point? Next time someone offers, sort of this vague, nebulous kind of help, you can have something that you can ask for specifically. Kind of make a list of go-to things. Again, I know it's easier said than done, and same thing with saying yes when people do offer specific help. And then the last of the big three is be kind to yourself. We really do have to learn how to be our own best friends and to advocate for ourselves and nurture ourselves. Caregivers are quite accustomed to nurturing others, but not necessarily to nurturing ourselves. And in fact, many of the caregivers that I know can be quite hard on themselves. I often will challenge my clients and say, would you say this about your best friend, or would you say this to your child? If not, then why is it okay to say this to yourself or about yourself? You deserve kindness, you deserve love and rest and pleasure, and sometimes we have to be the ones to get those things for ourselves. And I think that right now is one of those times for most of us that we really do have to be the ones who are looking out for ourselves and getting our own needs met. Because again, we are often, during this time, I think, have really been living kind of in silos. But aside from the big three, self-care is usually, the best self-care is short, sweet, cheap, and free. And really the basic stuff matters. Are you getting enough to eat? Are you eating healthily? Are you staying hydrated? Are you getting enough rest? Social connection is important, even if it's through Zoom, even if it's on the phone. Trying to stay connected is really essential for mental health. Making sure that we're getting basic health care, that we're getting ourselves to the doctor and to the dentist. And then entertainment, pleasure, recreation of some kind is really essential for well-being. Even if it's, watching something mindless on TV or doing a crossword puzzle, we need something that is enjoyable and free. So we can't just work all the time. So this is a self-care wheel, and I believe it will be available to all of you after the presentation. It just has some more specific ideas for self-care. And I know we're running short on time, so I'll wrap it up, but just to go through these really quickly, because I think it is important to emphasize that self-care really at its best is simple. And so some of the best self-care we can do may just simply be stretching or going for a walk, getting some fresh air, eating nourishing meals, making sure that we're hydrated again, taking a bath or a shower, and trying to do these things with some intention, trying to take a little bit of time and create a little bit of space to do these things in a way that's not just taking a few bites or sips in between activities, but is doing it mindfully. Some self-care ideas for the mind: simple breathing exercises, talk therapy, support groups, journaling, and then it can be things like limiting our news intake and social media, avoiding things that are emotionally triggering or anxiety provoking to us, talking to loved ones, again, setting boundaries, saying no, and then acknowledging our feelings, which is something that we've been talking about, right? It's acknowledging our emotional and mental responses to the losses that we're all encountering during this time. Spending time in nature can also be really profoundly healing. Prayer, meditation, spending time alone is important too, I think. There's a need to connect with others, but sometimes we also need moments of silence and privacy. I think especially for caregivers, that's important. Creating art, listening to music, singing, and then feeling our feelings is really important. Letting ourselves laugh, letting ourselves cry, or stomp our feet, or whatever else we need to do when intense emotions come up. It's all really important to self-care and to our well-being and to being able to navigate this really challenging time. I'd like to just quickly mention a couple of resources. If you are grieving the death of a loved one, Frederick Health Hospice would be eager to support you. We do offer grief counseling at no cost. We also have support groups. They're limited right now just because of the restrictions that we have as far as seeing people face to face, but we do have some virtual groups starting up. And we also have a Coping with the Holidays workshop coming up and some other financial workshops and things like that. So please do visit our website, frederickhealthhospice.org. And then Frederick Grief Support Network is something that my colleagues and I created at the beginning of the pandemic. And if you're interested in more ideas about mindfulness techniques or specific self-care exercises or journaling prompts, we have whole pages dedicated to those topics on the website. And I would also recommend the Frederick Meditation Center, if that's something that you're interested in. They have great guided meditations. Yoga More is another great resources. And then for a full list of support groups, you can go to this link. It's actually through FCC. My email is here. Please feel free to take it down and reach out if there's anything that I can do to help you, or if you have questions or want more information about our programs at hospice. And that's it for me. I'm going to take some questions now.
All right, Kylie, thank you so much. Let's see if we can take down the screen. There we go. All right, does anybody have any questions for Kylie about grief, loss, adjusting, coping? A heavy topic. This is hard to talk about, and I think all of us, again, are struggling with all of the changes. And I know myself, there are good days and upbeat days, and there are other days that I am just struggling. And I would imagine that all of you are often feeling the same thing. I appreciated Kylie's suggestions. Taking care of ourselves doesn't have to be fancy or expensive or take time. As lovely as going to the spa might sound to some, that's expensive and timely and maybe not even safe right now, but taking a few minutes to yourself to walk outside, get some fresh air, take a break from your loved one. Those are quick things that you can do.
There's one question. Kylie, I was wondering, I know there's not a clear time frame, and you sort of just talked about this, but how long does sort of normal grief, especially maybe not the death of a loved one, but other types of grief, how long would you say is kind of a normal time span approximately, like to determine whether grief is going on too long and that I need to get help or something like that?
Sure. So it's a great question, and it's not one that has the most clear answer. I think grief is highly individual. And while we can say broadly speaking that after the death of a loved one, usually after the first year things become more manageable. We find that for grieving parents and grieving spouses sometimes too, that it really is more like after 2 years. If we're talking about something that's a diagnosable or worrisome condition, that would require grief therapy, then we're looking at grief that goes beyond 1 year and is of such intensity that it interferes with daily life. But something that I think is really important, and especially, you said specifically with non-death losses, is that non-death losses are often not like a one and done. No losses, right? That there are often secondary losses that attach to it, so that you might have a primary loss, and then off of that come a bunch of other losses that you then also have to navigate. And so it's really, it's a dynamic experience. It's not something, static that happens once and then that's it. There's a loss event, and then there are things that kind of trail off of that. And so trying to, again, deduce what exactly has been lost, and to identify the different aspects of that experience takes time. And I think that grief in many ways from a single loss is something that persists throughout our life. We come to a place of being able to manage it, being able to understand it and to live with it, but we're forever changed by it. So it's hard to give a timeline. I don't know if I really answered the question, but I think I would say that there's not much to worry about unless it's you're finding that your grief is really interfering with your ability to function and to do the things that you want to do and need to do. And most timelines are pretty acceptable.
Kylie, we have another great question. So how does a caregiver get a family to understand that they're not ready to jump into something else after they've spent so much time as a caregiver? Their loved one has passed, but they're still grieving, but the family wants them to be feeling good. How do we help that conversation?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think something that it's really important to state and to honor about caregiving is that it's something that that you put your all into. When you're your loved one's caregiver, you put your whole self into that, and caregiving becomes very much, I think, a part of our identity when we do that. And I think a lot of the people that I work with, after their loved one dies, they kind of face not only their grief for their loved one, but there's this huge question of identity. What does my life look like now that I'm not actively caregiving? And there can be just a gigantic hole there, where the loved one was, and where that whole way of life was, that's now changed. And it's profoundly painful and disorienting. And there are a lot of really complex emotions that need to be worked through, I think, and that you deserve the time and the space to be able to work through. So our friends and family, meanwhile, when they want to urge us to move on or to find something to distract ourselves with or to feel better. But the truth is that we have a right to feel our grief and to experience that and to mourn. And again, that's sometimes a lengthy process, and it's certainly a complicated one. So I think the best advice I can give is that, as uncomfortable as it might be, it's important to be really explicit about, I'm just not ready to do this right now, or that to say, what I'm really needing right now is just some time and space, or what I'm really needing right now is just someone to listen to me. You know, again, I think it can be uncomfortable to advocate for ourselves, but you have a right to grieve. You have a right to mourn and to feel everything that you're feeling, and to not be rushed through that process.
Uh, on that same very uncomfortable vein, Kylie, how about for a caregiver who is working with someone who is declining in front of them? They're grieving while the person is still alive, and they feel guilty for thinking that death might actually be welcome, that they're no longer suffering. Help put that in context for our folks.
Sure. Yeah, that's, I actually was just talking to my colleague a couple days ago about that very thing. And she was sharing a little bit about her experience as a caregiver to her mother before she died. And we were talking about how, you know, a really uncomfortable piece of this that isn't talked about often enough is that that relief of some kind is often part of death, and that causes us intense guilt, I think, and both in the anticipatory grief part of this, that if that question crosses your mind of what will this be like, you know, after they're gone, and even, you know, at least I won't have to deal with this. I mean, we're human; these thoughts come up, and they're normal and natural, but they can cause us to feel horrible pain and guilt, you know, that these things would even cross our mind. And certainly after our loved one's death, and I can say that I've experienced this for myself, you know, feeling a sense of relief, and then feeling so horrible about that. But the truth about relief is that it's never, oh, I'm so glad that they're not here anymore. That's not what it is. It's I'm so glad that they're not suffering anymore. And it can also be a relief that you're not suffering anymore. But that suffering isn't because of the amount of effort that caretaking took. It's because of the amount of pain that was caused by seeing your loved one suffer, and in preparing to say goodbye to them. That's agonizing, it's painful, it's exhausting. And so experiencing relief is really normal. And if anything, I think that relief is a testament to the amount of love that you have for the person that you're caring for.
Kylie, thank you. Again, I think you noted that we can share this PowerPoint if people want to connect with you or the grief support groups or other resources that you shared, we can send them out to them.
Yes.
Perfect. So I will say, folks, really, I think one of the best things that you can do as a caregiver for yourself in the midst of a pandemic is get connected with somebody. And I think a support group, whether it's a grief support group or a caregiver support group, having other people to communicate with and laugh with and share your pain and your joy is really a wonderful way to survive what you're going through, what we're all going through. So I really encourage you to reach out to one of the groups that Kylie's mentioned. Certainly there are a number of caregiver support groups that are working on Zoom virtually, the Alzheimer's Association, Daybreak, the Senior Center. There's a lot of options out there. So get yourself connected. Continue to stay connected with us. Kylie, thank you for this presentation today. Next month on November 12th, McGean White from the Alzheimer's Association is going to be presenting on navigating the holidays. We know that holidays are hard in the best of times, but this year is going to be a doozy, I think. So please join us for some great conversation about navigating the holidays. And then in December, we'll be talking about navigating the detours. You think things are headed in one direction, and sometimes out of the blue, you get knocked off course. So we'll be talking about how to manage that best. So again, Kylie, thank you for being with us today. I appreciate it. Our group appreciates it. All of you, thank you so much for being with us tonight. We know that you're busy, and I really look forward to seeing you next month. Thanks, everybody.